In the early 16th century, Florence and Rome remained the two primary centers of artistic production in Italy. However, wealthy and powerful families and individuals offered patronage in other regions as well. Venice, Urbino, Mantua, and a few other northern Italian cities were thriving regional aristocratic courts and merchant centers that were often humanist inspired and intellectually inclined. Now, political alliances, especially in the northern part of Italy, were constantly shifting during the 16th century because we've got the Holy Roman Empire, the Dukes of Milan, the kings of France, and the rulers of Venice all vying for control of this Veneto region and then this sort of Lombardy region here. Now, Venice is where we're going to start. In the 16th century, Venice was a great commercial power in the Mediterranean, which led to very wealthy citizens who became prominent patrons of art and architecture. Venetian culture was relatively conservative, meaning they'd preserved many aspects of their Byzantine heritage, which sort of encouraged art with rich patterns and an emphasis on light and color. Venetian painters were some of the first Italians to adopt oil paint from Flanders, and they were the first to transition from frescoes to large canvas paintings. The flexibility of the canvas support, coupled with the radiance and depth of oil-suspended pigments, eventually made oil on canvas the preferred medium. Venetian painters were known for their expressively loose brushwork and sophisticated luminous color palettes based on close observations of how different colors interact with light. And with oil paints, they could develop purer, more saturated hues with better reflective and refractive qualities than they could with tempera. Additionally, while Central Italian artists favored linear methods, which they referred to as disegno, um, in which objects and forms are drawn with a crisp contour outline and then filled in with color, Venetians instead favored the color technique, in which forms were sort of built up and modeled softly around the edges using gradations of color and light without a line drawing. Giorgione's career was short, as he died of the plague in his 30s, and scholars only accept about 10 works as being entirely created by him. However, he was incredibly important to Venetian painting. He was one of the first artists to adopt oils and canvas, and he introduced a new and mysterious pastoral or countryside type of scene called a poesy, or painted poem, which was based on poetic descriptions of antiquity from authors like Virgil. Now, these were not to tell a specific story, but rather to create a specific mood. And his appreciation for the natural landscape within these paintings is also quite significant. Now, this one is one of his most well-known and compelling works, titled The Tempest, and it was painted shortly before the artist's death. The scene depicts a young man on one side in contemporary clothing, sometimes interpreted as a soldier, other times as an aristocrat sort of wandering the countryside. And then on the right, we have a woman who sits on the ground, completely nude except for this long white cloth draped over her shoulder, and she is nursing her child. Her direct gaze sort of traps the viewer and keeps our attention fixed on her. But in the surrounding landscape, we can see ancient Roman ruins, a rustic village, a bridge, and a more contemporary town in the distance. Giorgione has created this sense of depth using atmospheric perspective, and he's really demonstrating an awareness of the air, the wind, and the weather conditions within the scene. We've got these sort of dark, ominous storm clouds gathering in the sky, and this bright lightning bolt that sort of splits them. In a way, this sort of generates a kind of emotional tempest in this otherwise quiet scene. And then the entire composition is really bathed in this sort of warm golden light, which will become characteristic of Venetian paintings. But here it seems to sort of hang on the haze and kind of imply how sometimes the air seems to thicken before a big storm like this. Now, scholars believe this was made for Gabriele Benjamin, a wealthy Venetian merchant who was also in politics, and the ambiguous poetic subject matter would have been something the elite Venetian clientele would have been interested in as a way to sort of show off how educated and cultured they were. Now, x-rays have revealed that Giorgione originally painted a second nude woman over here in the left, and then later changed it to this male figure. Some scholars argue that the figures are meant to be allegorical figures of fortitude and charity, or perhaps of Adam and of Eve. But I think it's more likely that Giorgione was just sort of experimenting with these generic figure types in this very idyllic pastoral landscape. Before his death in 1510, Giorgione was associated with another Venetian painter known as Titian. This painting, titled The Pastoral Concert, has been attributed to both artists, though scholars now agree on Titian as the artist. Not a lot is known about Titian's early life, but he certainly absorbed the style of his contemporary Giorgione, including his interest in pastoral subjects and richly colored oil paints on canvas. And we do know that he completed at least one of Giorgione's unfinished works. Pastoral Concert presents another idyllic sort of landscape here, again bathed in this hazy golden light with an ambiguous narrative, much like Giorgione's Tempest. We have an aristocratic musician in a red satin robe and cap playing this stringed instrument, while a barefoot shepherd in homespun robes sings along. The two men sort of turn toward each other, seemingly oblivious to the two nude female figures who appear in the foreground. One of the female figures is seated and plays a flute, while the other stands and dips water from this well. Both women have this white sort of cloth drapery, which has fallen to the ground and is really doing more to call attention to their nudity rather than to cover it. Now, the artist has really modeled their figures using chiaroscuro and softly blended colors to create the illusion of soft, fleshy, sort of volumetric bodies. Now, in the background, we have another shepherd and his animals, and then in the farther distance, we have maybe a country villa or the city. And the whole scene really has this sense of sort of quiet, calm tranquility, filled only with the sounds of nature and music. Now, this has often been interpreted as an allegory on the creation of music or poetry. The female figures may be intended as creative muses, but another interpretation suggests that these women represent courtesans. Now, this was a practice in Venice that was modeled after antiquity, in which independent women, educated in literature, art, dance, music, and courtly culture, were hired to sort of entertain wealthy men without the expectation of marriage. Now, these were not prostitutes, although I suppose some of them did become mistresses as well. Rather, they were sort of witty, worldly, well-dressed women with good social skills that could entertain both men and women at dinner parties. And they moved pretty freely throughout society, and some of them married and used their positions as courtesans to advance their family status. Now, it wouldn't be unheard of for Titian to have disguised some specific courtesans as muses in a scene like this in order to make it into something that was more socially acceptable in the realm of visual art. It was actually quite common for artists to disguise courtesans and other images of nude women as Venus, the Roman goddess of love and beauty, again, to make it into a more socially acceptable subject for visual art. Paintings of nude, reclining women became quite popular, especially in court circles, where men could quote unquote appreciate Venus under the cloak of a respectable sort of interest in antiquity. Now, this work, which is usually known as the Sleeping Venus, this was traditionally attributed to Giorgione, but it's generally accepted now that Titian finished the landscape and the sky after Giorgione's death in 1510. Now, the reclining pose here is sort of modeled after Greek and Roman depictions of goddesses and nymphs, and it sort of suggests this air of entitlement or elite power or status, as if this woman is completely accustomed to being waited upon and completely comfortable being observed in this state. This painting is actually the first reclining female nude created since antiquity, that we know of at least. But this is definitely an idea that Titian picked up and expanded upon, and ultimately it develops into a long standing tradition in Western art history. So here we have Titian's Venus of Urbino, which is a perfect example of this type of painting. It depicts a life-sized, nude female figure labeled Venus by many, reclining seductively on a bed covered in rich linens. She gazes sort of coyly out at the viewer, and her hair, kind of golden curls of her hair cascade over her shoulder. Her pose is very purposefully sensual, and she sort of strategically positioned herself in an almost modest fashion, but again, in this way that really sort of draws attention to her nudity rather than disguising it. We have this little dog that's kind of curled up, sleeping on the bed at her feet. And then in the background, we can see this large, kind of spacious interior through this partially opened curtain. And it seems to be sort of an upper class bedroom, and we have these two female attendants who are either taking clothing out or storing clothing away in this chest. Now, one interpretation of this work is based on the knowledge that Titian, the artist, worked for the Emperor Charles V, where paintings of courtesans were quite popular, sort of within his court. We also know that in 1534, Titian was working on a painting of a woman for Cardinal Ippolito de' Medici, who had recently been spending time with a very well-known Venetian courtesan named Angela Zapata. Now, unfortunately, the cardinal died in about 1535, so it's possible that the painting may have simply remained with Titian in his studio until 1538, when Guidobaldo della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino, saw it and bought it, which explains why it's called the Venus of Urbino now. Now, another possible interpretation, which is argued by various art historians and scholars like Rona Goffin, is based on the knowledge that around 1534, the Duke of Urbino married Julia Verano. So it's possible that the Duke commissioned this painting to celebrate this marriage. At the time, Julia was only 10 years old, but she would have been about 14 by the time this painting appeared in the Duke's court in Urbino. So it's possible that this was intended as a private portrait to sort of commemorate the consummation of the marriage. And it does include several bridal or marital symbols and references that sort of support this theory. So, for example, the woman is holding this small bouquet of roses and myrtle, which are both flowers that are sort of used as traditional bridal symbols. Additionally, the little sleeping dog at her feet can be interpreted as a symbol of loyalty, fidelity, and domesticity. And perhaps most importantly, the attendants who are seen back here in the background, either taking clothing out of or maybe putting clothing into this chest, these are actually a pair of very richly carved cassoni, or these sort of large chests that were frequently commissioned as bridal gifts and used to store wedding gifts, a bride's dowry, her clothing, and her personal objects. So it's possible then that this entire scene would have meant more about sort of marriage and fidelity than sexuality, or even mythology to the contemporary viewer. The vibrancy of Titian's paint surfaces is very nearly unmatched, or at least he's up there with the great masters of oil paints like Jan van Eyck. He really built up his forms with fine glazes of pure colors, and he would often include as many as 10 to 15 layers in a single painting. He also had an advantage working in Venice, which was the first place where merchants produced a wide range of specially prepared pigments, and who would sometimes even mix their oil paints with ground glass to increase their luminosity. Now, this is a slightly earlier work. It was commissioned in 1519 by Jacopo Pesaro, a commander of the Papal naval fleet, to commemorate a previous victory. He asked Titian to create an altarpiece for a side aisle in the Franciscan church of Santa Maria Glorioso dei Frari in Venice. Titian worked on this piece for 7 years, and he changed the concept 3 times before he finally settled on this. We have sort of this asymmetrical composition, And he's sort of built his forms using color and diagonal lines rather than vertical or horizontal arrangements. Um, he depicts these huge marble columns standing on tall bases that sort of stretch up and out of the picture frame. And then within this architectural space, he's arranged the Virgin and Child sort of high and to the right, seated on perhaps a throne. And then we have saints and various members of the Pissarro family in the space below. Now, the central figure here is St. Peter. And then to the left of St. Peter, kind of in the background, we have St. Maurice, who holds this red Pissarro banner, which really contrasts St. Peter's rich blue robe, while St. Peter's kind of yellow mantle here really brings out the yellow of the papal coat of arms here on this banner. Now, additionally, Peter's blue robe sort of emphasizes the blue mantle that crosses over Mary's red robe, which in turn balances out the red of the banner. Now, in the foreground to the right, we have members of the Pissarro family kneeling, sort of illuminated with this light from above. The rich red cloak of this man in the foreground creates, again, sort of further contrast with Peter's blue robe, and then it also crosses Peter and kind of counterbalances the red banner, as well as Mary's red robe kind of directly above him. And so this sort of forms a compositional triangle between those 3 points of red. Behind him, we have this kind of young member of the family who is looking out at the viewer quite directly, which really sort of guarantees our engagement and kind of pulls us into the scene. On the opposite side, to the left, we have a kneeling Jacopo, the donor or the patron for this work. And then he is positioned in front of this cowering prisoner of war, which sort of reminds us that this was commissioned in celebration of Jacopo's fleet's victory. And then above this entire scene, we have these little putti figures floating on a fluffy cloud and carrying this cross, which is meant to remind us of the greater Christian victory, sort of in general. Now, in the later part of the 16th century, we have an artist named Jacopo Robusti, who is actually better known by his nickname Tintoretto, which means little dryer because his father was a dryer. But he really takes Venetian painting in a different direction. Tintoretto sought to combine Titian's coloring with Michelangelo's drawing, or in other words, he wanted to reach this balanced synthesis of color and line within his compositions. So here we have his Last Supper from about 1592 to 94, though it's quite different than Da Vinci's famous scene that we saw in a few lectures prior to this one from about a century earlier. Tintoretto presents this sort of corner view with a vanishing point that's positioned sort of high on this horizon line at the far right. This table makes for a dramatic kind of diagonal across the scene, and then the coffered ceiling and this sort of patterned tile on the floor recede along those same orthogonal lines. This dark interior scene is sort of illuminated by this single oil lamp hanging from the ceiling. And then also we have sort of this supernatural light source coming from the divine kind of light emanating from the halos of Christ and his apostles. Now, these strong contrasts of light and dark sort of emphasize certain areas, yet they obscure other areas. Tintoretto really uses deep hues of red and blue that sort of barely emerge from the darkness, while intense highlights and elongated figures add to the intensely spiritual, sort of otherworldly mood. Christ is sort of in the center of the composition, although he's sort of off center at the table itself. And he sort of bends and gestures towards Judas. We've got these ghostly angels that sort of hover around above, and they are again illuminated by this kind of oil lamp, while servants, apostles, and angels move and sort of turn in what is almost a continuous line kind of up and throughout the entire composition. Small details like the still life arrangements on the table or this cat in the foreground provide sort of relatable aspects that the viewers can connect with. And then Tintoretto kind of he perfectly fuses aspects of spiritual mysticism with elements of humanism by kind of incorporating the everyday into this very miraculous event. Additionally, his very characteristic loose brushstroke implies the speed at which he worked, which was criticized as being rather careless in his time, but it's been highly admired by numerous 20th century gestural painters. In the second half of the 16th century, the Venetian stonemason and architect Andrea Palladio was hired by a wealthy humanist, Giangiorgio Trissino, from Venice, who wanted to introduce classical architecture to the Veneto region in order to, quote, promote his cultural aspirations and intellectual leanings. Trissano sent Palladio to the south to study the architecture of Rome, the writings of Vitruvius, and the Renaissance architecture by Bramante, Michelangelo, and others. Palladio's creative adaptations made him one of the foremost architects in Italy, and one of the most influential architects in Europe and colonial American history. His buildings are characterized by harmonious symmetry and controlled ornamentation, and they utilize proportions based on ancient Roman structures. In his early career, he built In his early career, he built many villas and palaces in the Veneto region around Venice. Swamps were commonly drained to open up rich farmland where wealthy landowners could build these grand country homes in the style of ancient Roman villas and temples. Now, in the 1560s, Palladio was commissioned by Paolo Almercao for a villa to host social events, and ultimately this structure becomes Palladio's most well-known and influential work. Um, so the villa that we see here kind of incorporates classical architectural elements and emphasizes ideas of symmetry, radial balance, visual clarity, and uniformity, but it's also quite innovative. When it was finished in 1569, the villa was named Villa Rotunda because it includes a central kind of rotunda, which you can see better on the plan here, which was inspired by another famous round building, the Roman Pantheon. Now, in order to sort of show off the beautiful landscapes around the villa, Palladio designed this two-story square structure with four facades, each with its own elevated porch or portico, featuring 6 Ionic columns that support these triangular pediments. And then under a sort of narrow attic level here is where the porticos are situated, and then this is all topped with a central hemispherical dome. So the ground plan really shows the geometric clarity of Palladio's design. We have this circle inscribed within a square, inscribed within an even larger square, and then we have these sort of four projections, these rectangular compartments that protrude on every side of that square. Now, the interior side rooms built within this kind of square here, these opened into this central rotunda, and they were really designed to kind of emphasize the structure's geometric square and kind of cross format. The use of a central dome was quite innovative at this time because domes were typically associated with temples, churches, and public buildings rather than domestic ones. But Palladio really demonstrates his understanding of the dome's original context in imperial Roman homes. Now, the exterior brick of the Villa Rotunda has been covered in white stucco, which is a pretty cost-effective material that allows the designer to sort of simulate the aesthetic of marble. And then the villa is surrounded by these very formal garden spaces that further emphasize the beauty of the landscape and kind of the panoramic views of the villa. In Florence and Rome in the 1520s, some artists started to deliberately break the rules of classicism that defined the early and high Renaissance, such as mathematical perspective, anatomical realism, idealized symmetry, harmony, natural beauty, etc. Instead, artists began experimenting with asymmetry, tension, and artificial elegance, which resulted in the development of a new style that we call mannerism. Now, the word mannerism is derived from the Italian manneria, meaning style, and sometimes the Mannerist movement is sort of defined as the stylish style. It really became an anti-classical movement that favored artificial grace and elegance over order, balance, or lifelike references. It tends to be characterized by unusual colors, crowded and ambiguous spaces, the purposeful distortion of convention, beauty for beauty's sake, and the demonstration of virtuosity or extreme technical skill. Figures tend to be elongated and they often have dreamy expressions, but are placed in these rather strange, kind of twisted poses. Mannerist subject matter is often mysterious or obscure, often with references to poetry, riddles, and intellectual subjects, as well as religious or spiritual ones. Overall, Mannerism emphasized the individual creativity of the artist while expressing a sense of courtly elegance that really allowed wealthy patrons to show off sophistication and superior educations. Between 1525 and 1528, the artist Jacopo Carucci da Pontormo created frescoes and an altarpiece for the Camponi Chapel in the Church of Santa Felicita in Florence, and these really characterize this Mannerist style. The altarpiece composition, titled "Deposition", remains in its original frame and original location, and it's the most well-known work within this series. Pontormo presents the moment in which Christ is being deposed or removed from a here unseen cross. Now, since we don't see the cross, this is really sort of the moment after Christ's body has been removed. So, in some ways, it's less of a deposition scene than it is a lamentation or maybe just a presentation of Christ's body. But the composition is quite ambiguous. Pontormo has departed from the unified logical space of linear and atmospheric perspective, and instead we have this very shadowy ground and sky that sort of deny any real sense of space or depth for these figures to occupy. We have this sort of vertical overlapping mass of figures, some of which seem to press forward into our space while others seem to float upward. Individually, the figures have been posed to sort of enhance this artificial sense of elegance. We have these two young men kind of in the front or in the foreground who have sort of paused to regain their grip on Christ's limp body, but it almost seems as if they have sort of paused to pose, sort of like they're expecting their picture to be taken, or maybe like they're posing for this painting. It's rather artificial, right? And so they seem to be kind of both positioned up on their toes, somewhat precariously, and they're meant to be supporting the weight of this kind of heavy, swooping figure of Christ, although they seem to kind of float almost gracefully just inches above the ground. Around them, all of these other mourning figures kind of twist in emotional agony. The Virgin Mary is shown kind of off center here, just to the right. Um, and she sort of reaches across this empty space and her arm bends just slightly, creating kind of a curve that mimics the swooping body of Christ here. And those two curves are also sort of mimicked and reversed by maybe the curve of the sash in this pink dress or the curve of the orange sash around this boy here. So lots of repetition, lots of sort of rhythmic lines. Um, but Pontormo has not used the stable triangular format that was so popular during the High Renaissance. Instead, he gives us this rather chaotic scene of kind of interlocking figures. Additionally, he uses strange colors in unusual combinations, such as baby blue and pink with accents of olive green, yellow, and scarlet. This unstable boy here in the foreground sort of sets the tone for the entire painting with his skin tight, bright pink shirt, and it's sort of shaded with this pale grayish blue color. And then his rather anxious expression kind of stares out at the viewer, again, kind of grabbing our attention and pulling us in, and maybe setting the sort of tone for the emotionality of this scene. So again, Contorno has really demonstrated the key characteristics of mannerism in this composition. We've got spatial ambiguity, elongated figures with long necks and small heads depicted in these rather unstable poses with theatrical gestures and artificial or exaggerated emotions, all rendered in strange, artificial, almost dreamlike colors. Another artist who developed a distinct Mannerist style was Parmigianino, a native of Parma who studied in Rome from 1524 to 1527 before moving back to Bologna, then back to Parma. One of his best known works, which depicts a familiar subject yet experiments with Mannerist space and proportions, is this, which is known today as the Madonna of the Long Neck. This was commissioned in about 1534 by Ilana Baiardi, Ilana Baiardi Tagliaferri, for her family chapel. And the chapel was dedicated to the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. So Parmigianino presents us with a Madonna holding a sleeping Christ child, although the proportions here don't really conform to the classical ideal. Presumably, Mary is seated on a throne, but her figure is in this sort of odd twisting pose, and we're really unable to see any actual seat behind her. Her legs, her hips, and kind of her lower torso here have really been widened to create this sort of shelf-like space for the very languid body of Christ to kind of sprawl across. And, the widened portions of her figure really contrast with her very narrow kind of waist and shoulders, her very small head, and her very thin, kind of elongated neck. Now, there was a pretty popular medieval hymn that compared Mary's neck to a marble column as a way to describe her beauty. So perhaps Parmigianino has sort of elongated Mary's neck here to match that description. And then in the background, we also have this somewhat ambiguous column, which doesn't really support anything. Again, maybe as a way to sort of solidify this reference. Christ's body is also quite elongated, and it creates this rather graceful sort of curve across the composition, which really recalls the curve of Christ's body in Michelangelo's Pietà. It's really possible that Parmigianino was sort of looking back to this work specifically because there are several similarities beyond this curve of Christ's body, including those sort of distorted proportions of Mary, the elongation of the figures, and even this kind of diagonal sash right across Mary's chest. Christ's arm kind of falls limply down to the side, which creates this strong vertical line that kind of echoes that of the column in the background. Now here in kind of the lower right corner, situated sort of in the background, we have this small figure of Saint Jerome who unrolls this scroll. Now he's much too small for realistic perspective or proportions, especially since it seems like he's meant to exist really kind of in this middle ground between Mary on the throne and this column in the background. Now, maybe Parmigianino has included Jerome in this fashion as an example of the previous classical style and kind of proportions of the old era. But it's hard to say for sure. But it does kind of add to the ambiguity of the entire composition, I would say. Now over here on the opposite side, we have this kind of tight group of figures crowding around Mary on her throne. These are presumably angelic attendants. The female figure in the front kind of stands in what seems to be a classical yet exaggerated contrapposto, although we can only see this one kind of exposed leg, which again creates this, elongated, graceful, undulating vertical line that maybe we could say echoes the vertical here and here, kind of creates again this sense of rhythm or repetition throughout the composition. But this female figure, she sort of presents Mary with this polished silver vessel, which is painted, if you can see, with a red cross here on the front. There's a visual relationship between the shape of this vessel and the sort of swollen kind of middle section that it has and this sort of narrow flaring neck that it has. There's a visual relationship between it and the shape of Mary's figure. Some scholars suggest the relationship sort of references ideal feminine beauty in the 16th century, and that's probably accurate at least to a certain degree. But there's also this sort of symbolic connection between the two, because Mary is the vessel of Christ. And so this sort of reminds us that she is a vessel. And then the red cross painted on the vessel sort of foreshadows or alludes to Christ's eventual sacrifice and death. So again, Parmigianino has sort of presented us, like Pontormo, with this rather well-known subject, but in a challenging and sort of intriguing way that really favors this exaggerated sense of beauty and grace over reality. Although the colors here are much more natural than in Pontormo's deposition. Here they're quite rich and more along the lines of that high Renaissance or even maybe the Venetian tradition. In 1522, an artist named Bronzino became Pontormo's student and assistant, and he probably worked with him on the Capponi chapel commissions. In 1530, Bronzino established his own workshop, although he did continue to work with Pontormo on several larger projects. By 1540, Bronzino had become an official court painter for the Medici family, and he produced a number of elegant portraits as well as altarpieces, frescoes, and tapestry designs for his patrons. This work, titled Allegory with Venus and Cupid, is one of the strangest paintings from the 16th century in general, and it really serves as somewhat of a summary of this Mannerist movement. Now, this composition is quite strange. It includes 7 figures kind of packed within this tight pictorial space. We also have a couple masks, a dove, and several objects kind of sprinkled here in between. The figures are in these rather exaggerated poses, and individually they present the sort of graceful forms, polished surfaces, and delicate colors that characterize Mannerist art. However, there's this strange, rather erotic undertone within this complex and ambiguous composition. Now, this work was commissioned by the Duke Cosimo as a diplomatic gift for the French king, and it would have really been appreciated by the intellectuals at court. They wanted sophisticated puzzles that really made classical references but defied easy explanation, although they would have also truly appreciated the overt eroticism here, as well as Bronzino's high level of technical skill. So in the foreground, we have Venus and her son Cupid. They're sort of slightly off center and they're in this strange, sort of sensual interaction. Venus holds this golden apple of discord given to her by Paris down here in one hand, and then her other hand sort of reaches to pluck an arrow out of Cupid's quiver, sort of disarming him, perhaps. Notice the dove down here in the bottom left-hand corner. This is another sort of attribute of Venus, although here it sort of conforms to the shape of Cupid's foot without actually being stepped on. Sort of precarious placement for the dove. Over here to the right side, we have this sort of Puto figure who is striding rather confidently into the scene, kind of pulling back his arms, getting ready to throw these rose petals over Cupid and Venus. This figure has been interpreted as folly, or perhaps as pleasure, or even playfulness. Um, Directly below that figure, we have these two masks sort of right next to Venus's feet. These are perhaps references to ideas of deception or duplicity. And then in the upper right corner, we have this old man, probably meant to be Kronos, or the god of time, because we can sort of see his wings and then this hourglass that is kind of balanced upon his shoulders here. But he reaches into the scene and kind of reaches over to pull this blue curtain away from this other figure who seems to be quite shocked, even scandalized. This is probably meant to be truth or night, and he is trying to remove the curtain and kind of reveal the scene to all. Um, Behind Venus here, we have this kind of beautiful young girl, although notice that her head is attached to this sort of monstrous serpent-like body that has lion's legs and a scorpion's tail. Um, in one hand, she holds a honeycomb, which is maybe meant to symbolize sweetness or temptation, and then her other hand back here sort of pushes her tail and stinger behind her. This is maybe meant to symbolize the price of sweetness or the punishment for succumbing to temptation. And then we have this other strange figure kind of over here to the left in the shadows behind Cupid. He's this sort of pale, screaming man who his eyes are kind of clenched shut, his mouth is wide open, and he's kind of tearing at his hair. Scholars have most recently identified this character as being a victim of the venereal disease syphilis, which was a pretty rampant epidemic at this time. The whole painting can actually be potentially understood as a warning about the dangers of the disease. And in the 16th century, the disease was known to be spread through sex, kissing, and breastfeeding, which are all activities that are sort of alluded to here with this um, very erotic interaction between Cupid and Venus. So perhaps the message is that time reveals the price of pleasure. Maybe it sort of hints at the folly of lovers, or more specifically, at the dangers of illicit sex, which can include both emotional pain as well as the physical pain and disfiguration of venereal disease. Or it could be both, and even more than that, or it could be something else entirely. Really, the complex, kind of ambiguous narrative that seems to be presented here is kind of part of the point. Mannerist sculpture also tends to present highly stylized figures and forms in ways that emphasize technical skill, grace, and beauty. In the mid 16th century, the most influential sculptor in Italy was probably Jean Ballon, or Giambologna, a Flemish artist who was working in Florence for the Medici family. He was very influential, and he trained a whole generation of Italian sculptors, and he really spread the Mannerist style to the northern regions of Europe as well. His works kind of exemplify the characteristics of Mannerism by exploiting the idea of beauty for beauty's sake, and they also really showcase his artistic talent, often through figures which are composed using sinuous lines, graceful curves, sort of exaggerated gestures, and with they're sort of infused with this sense of hyper elegance and preciousness that really delighted contemporary viewers. So his most famous work today is this monumental marble sculpture from about 1581 or 82, which was titled The Capture or the Abduction of the Sabine Woman. Now, this was carved from a single piece of marble, and it's a dramatic sort of three-figural group, and it forms this rather energetic but tightly wound column that kind of twists upward in this serpentine-like pattern. And it really emphasizes the in the round aspect of this work and kind of encourages viewers to move around the freestanding sculpture in order to see the entire composition. Now, Giambologna created this composition not to depict a specific subject or narrative, but as sort of a formal exercise in figural representation and arrangement, and in technical virtuosity. He's demonstrating here his skills at depicting both male and female figures, joined in gesture and emotion. The treatment of the figures tells us that Giambologna had studied anatomy closely. Note we have sort of the tension in the musculature of the men as they crouch and kind of twist and extend upwards. And that really contrasts excuse me, that really contrasts with the sort of soft, fleshy form of the female figure, whose very classicized face is frozen in fear. She sort of extends this one arm upwards and outwards and creates this sort of balanced um, column, again, of these interlocking figures and these kind of crossing diagonal lines. Now, this work was given its title by a member of the Florentine Academy of Design after it was put on display, because the composition seemed to illustrate an event from a story in Roman history. After the founding of the city of Rome, Romulus and his mostly male followers realized that they now needed wives in order to produce the next generation of Roman citizens. They tried to negotiate with their neighbors, the Sabines, but the Sabines were worried that Rome would become too powerful and therefore banned them from marrying Sabine women. Later, the Roman men snuck into the festival of Neptune, where lots of Sabines and other neighboring citizens attended, and they kidnapped many Sabine women and forced them into marriage. So Giambologna might not have intended for this composition to sort of illustrate that particular narrative, nor did he intend for this work to have the political implications that it did. But contemporary viewers really recognize that story within the composition, and therefore this doesn't really paint Rome, which was Florence's rival at the time, doesn't really paint them in a very pretty light. So the Protestant Reformation begins in about 1517, sort of openly challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Pope Clement VII really misjudged the threat that this posed, and he really paid very little attention to the reformers, and ultimately that allowed the movement to spread. Then in 1527, the largely Protestant troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V attacked and sacked the city of Rome. It wasn't until Pope Paul III took charge in 1534 that the Church began pursuing reform in response to the rise of Protestantism in what we now refer to as the Counter Reformation or the Catholic Reformation. Um, Now, Pope Paul III sought to rebuild and restore Rome, and he really commissioned some of the finest works of art and architecture from the late Italian Renaissance. Additionally, in 1536, he opened an investigation into charges of church corruption, and then later he convened the Council of Trent, which was a series of meetings between about 1545 and 1563 between clerical and theological advisors from across Europe to counteract the Protestant threat. The Council of Trent sought to redefine the dogmas of the Catholic Church, stop administrative abuses, initiate discipline and reform, regulate clerical training, and prosecute heretics. Pope Paul III also challenged Protestantism through repression and censorship. In 1542, he instituted the Inquisition, a papal office which sought out heretics for interrogation, trial, and sentencing. This enforcement of religious unity did extend well into the visual art realm. Guidelines issued by the Council of Trent limited what could and could not be represented in Christian art, and this led to the destruction and censorship of many existing works. Traditional images of Christ and the saints were typically approved, but art was examined very closely for heresy or profanity. Ultimately, the Catholic Reformation promoted a renewed emphasis on sacred art and architecture as a way to inspire faith amongst congregations and bring people back to the Catholic Church. The first major commission Pope Paul III made brought Michelangelo back to the Sistine Chapel almost 20 years after he had completed the ceiling. Between 1536 and 1541, Michelangelo, who was now in his 60s, worked on an expansive Last Judgment fresco on the 48-foot altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. The dramatic scene covers the entire wall and abandons the very clearly organized medieval conception of the Last Judgment. Instead, Michelangelo presents a rather mannerist scene, crowded with over 300 figures in an infinite variety of distorted poses, sort of writhing together in these swarms. While the composition may seem completely unorganized and chaotic, the artist has actually arranged his figures in sort of tiers and in these sort of registers. Often this is divided into quadrants, with Christ kind of being in the middle here, and then just under Christ being in kind of the middle horizontally. So in the center of our composition, we have a youthful, muscular Christ who sort of raises his arm as if he's about to strike, which implies that he is the sword of justice. And then under his raised arm, we have the Virgin Mary, who is slightly smaller than Christ. And surrounding the pair, we have the hosts of heaven, various saints, angels, and biblical figures. In the sky, kind of above, we have these groups of angels who carry at the left the cross, and then at the right this marble column, which are meant to reference Christ's flagellation and then subsequent crucifixion. Then down here, kind of along the bottom, we have the blessed and the damned receiving their judgment. So here in kind of the bottom left quadrant, we have the blessed being awakened and pulled from their graves by these angels who are depicted as very classically idealized human men without wings. Here we have an angel using a set of rosary beads to kind of pull these human beings up to his cloud. These individuals will then sort of ascend to join this vortex of figures kind of up and around Christ. Now, in the lower right quadrant, we have the damned, and despite the efforts of some of these angels who seem to be trying to help them, they are being grabbed by demons and kind of dragged towards hell. We have the fires of hell kind of over here in the corner, and then just above the altar, which would be kind of down here in front of the wall, and then this Christ on the cross is part of that altar. Just behind that, we have the sort of entrance to hell, and you can see individuals there. And then just to the side, we have Charon, the ancient Greek ferryman of the dead to the underworld, who's sort of whacking these individuals with his oar as he transports them. So Michelangelo depicts a set of events that have really yet to happen, but when they do, they will directly affect the viewer, that is, the members of the church congregation and its officials. So this scene serves as a reminder that ultimately they too will face stern judgment at the end of time. And this really fits the Counter-Reformation's kind of goals to highlight the seriousness of heresy and the punishments that one might face for it, and to really inspire people to kind of return to the Catholic Church. Now, Michelangelo also seems to sort of included himself in these events. Here, just to the side of Christ, kind of next to his feet, we see Saint Bartholomew, who was martyred by being flayed alive. And so here he is seated on this cloud. He's kind of turning to look at Christ, and in one hand he holds this knife, and in the other hand he holds his flayed human skin. Now, Michelangelo seemingly has transformed this skin into a bit of a self-portrait. Now, perhaps this is meant to kind of imply that Michelangelo is sort of contemplating the fate of his own soul as well, or maybe at least acknowledging his own sins and recognizing that even he will not be exempt from the judgment of Christ. Now, Michelangelo has presented most of the figures within this scene as nude, and this is a pretty controversial choice to go in a chapel for the cardinals of the Catholic Church, despite the reintegration of the nude into 15th century Italian art. The inclusion of a nude female figure, St. Catherine of Alexandria, sort of leaning over her wheel during her martyrdom, was considered extremely scandalous, and conservative clergy members really criticized Michelangelo's use of nudity in general. And after his death in 1564, they actually hired his student, Daniel de Volterra, to come in and cover all of the nude men with little loincloths and to remove the female figure's nudity altogether. So, this green kind of draping dress that we see St. Catherine wearing here, that was not original. That was the addition of Michelangelo's student, as was probably this kind of draping cloth that hides the nudity of this male figure here. Another of Pope Paul III's ambitious projects was the completion of New St. Peter's, which had been under construction for about 40 years at this point. And again, he turned to Michelangelo, who is now about 71 years old, in order to complete the job. Michelangelo was familiar with the work that his predecessors, including Bramante and Raphael, had done on this structure, and when he began his work in 1546, he demanded the right to deal directly with the Pope rather than having to go through a committee of construction officials. He further surprised everyone by undoing some of the existing architectural design, which had been added by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger. Michelangelo sought to return to and simplify Bramante's earlier central plan and to create a single sort of unified space covered with a hemispherical dome. Now, 17th century additions will further alter the plan and the interior appearance of the church, but Michelangelo's design is still evident in the contrasting forms of the flat and sort of angled exterior walls and these three surviving kind of hemispherical protruding structures. He also included huge pilasters and blind windows, or these niches that are not actually pierced, that sort of surround the sanctuary. And then this central dome, which was actually completed by Giacomo della Porta after Michelangelo's death, it still retains Michelangelo's basic design, which included segmented kind of regularly spaced ribs. And it included situating the dome on a high drum with these sort of pedimented windows between paired columns, and then it's all topped with this tall lantern.